All right, high rollers, our guest today is an author and expert at the poker tell. That's what he does. He studies players and their mannerisms, how they hold themselves at the table, what they're doing, what they're saying, how they're acting, and he's written 2 books about it, Reading Poker Tells and Verbal Poker Tells. Zachary Elwood, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, Derek. Thanks for having me, sir.
Tell us about your video series for Poker Tells. Excellent content. I know that. I watched the trailer today. Looks like you got some good stuff in there.
Hey, thanks. I'm pretty excited about it. I released the first videos July of last year and been adding to it since then, and I'll continue to add to them. I partnered with Windy City Poker Championships, which is a show produced in Chicago, and I used their footage. It was great to find somebody whose footage I can use, because that's one of the things you want to find, somebody who will provide you some good footage to use. And so basically, I go through and make videos about different behaviors that I find in the footage. I take notes on all their shows and on their past shows, and keep it all in a database. And then when I get enough of a certain behavior to make it worthwhile to make a video out of, I make a video out of it.
Now, I know you're big on social media, Facebook and Twitter. You're always sending these videos out there. What kind of response do you get from the poker playing public?
Yeah, it's good. I mean, I've been pretty popular with the Twitter and the Instagram, and people, they seem to have responded. I mean, I think people like my Twitter account. Like, I'll occasionally post interesting, stills or videos to Twitter, and I think people enjoy watching those things.
I was really enthralled with the trailer. Some areas that you point out in that trailer, I'd like some thoughts on each if you don't mind. First off, the double checking of the hole cards. I mean, this happens all the time in poker rooms right around the world, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that one specifically, that video was about double checking hole cards before betting, and that was a very specific, subsection of double checking hole cards. Basically, like when somebody checks their cards right before they make a significant bet, post flop, basically. And yeah, that was an interesting one. So basically, to describe the pattern, people who do that are very unlikely to be bluffing, because bluffers don't like to check, and potentially show weakness by having to check their cards before betting. So usually when you see that, it's going to mean somebody who's very comfortable and has a good hand. Pre-flop, I think it can be a little bit different, actually. When I made that video, I was specifically making it about post-flop situations, because I think the very specific nature of it makes it more accurate. I'm not really that I don't have strong opinions about that pre-flop, but basically, yeah, it's my opinion is, like, post-flop, when somebody double checks their cards right before they bet, and then they bet, it's very likely to be strength. And it was interesting, because to me it seems, I started thinking about it months ago, and to me it seemed kind of obvious. Like, once I thought of it, I was like, oh yeah, that makes complete sense. Like, logically, like, a bluffer wouldn't want to accidentally imply weakness before they bet, But, it's one of those things where it's kind of like in plain sight, and when you haven't thought about that specifically, it's kind of hidden in plain sight. But once I realized it, I started seeing it all the time when I was playing. I play 2-5 and 5-10 cash games, and I started seeing it all the time. I started seeing it a good amount, and then I saw it in the televised footage, and I was like, oh, I'll make a video out of that. And I quickly found enough examples of it, and hardly ever, I basically found, like, no examples of bluffers doing it. So it just tells you how powerful that one is.
You've identified one area that you're pretty sure that's a definite tell, because I was going to ask you, you see the same mannerisms at the poker table all the time, but is it player dependent on when they do certain things? Like, one guy might do the same thing as another, but it means a totally different thing.
Sure, and for the most part, that's the best way to think about it. I mean, there are some tells that are more likely than others to be, very reliable no matter what, even on a cold read. But then, for most tells, you do want to get a sense that it's showing up a specific way, for a player, or even if it's the case of being able to peg a player as fairly inexperienced or whatever, to know that you probably can rely on some of the, the basic tells. But, for the most part, it's safe to assume that nothing is set in stone. And it's safe to come from the perspective of, like, I'd like to see somebody how they're acting before I act on a tell. Before I base a big decision on a tell. Because there's no one size fits all tells. I mean, there's definitely some tells that are more likely to be reliable than others in a cold read. But yeah, you always want to come from, I'd like to see it in practice before I base a big decision on it anyway. I mean, there's some situations where you can base fairly small decisions on some tells that you're confident about in a vacuum, but those are usually smaller decisions.
I want to ask you about some other instances, but first, your goal, as stated on your website, readingpokertells.com, is to help people better understand the behavior of their opponents, and that must take all forms, right? I mean, this is a lifelong endeavor for you here.
Yeah, it's been pretty time consuming, honestly. Like, for example, like when I wrote my second book, Verbal Poker Tells, I started out thinking I'd spend a few months on that, and I spent 8 months on it full time, like no lie, no exaggeration. If anything, it was like more than 40-hour work weeks, 8 months straight, and it wasn't like I set out planning to put that much work into it. It was like, in order to do the job right, I kept finding new things to think about, and it took that long for me to put out what I thought was a good book about the subject, because it kept getting increasingly complex as I looked into like all the notes that I'd taken and all the in my database of like recording all the verbal behavior. It got pretty complex, and I wanted to do a good job, and I'm very proud of that book because I spent so long on it. Yeah, it's a complex area. Any behavioral stuff at all is, humans are complex people, and it's hard to try to find what the interesting and the meaningful stuff is, and what the non-meaningful stuff is.
Poker's a very psychological game, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, depending on the context. I mean, I think it doesn't have to be. It often is. I don't, and that's just because humans are emotional people. Emotional beings. So I think when it comes to some people, it's less emotional and less psychological than for others, like people who, like very strong players who play like sort of a set route way or whatever. They don't let the psychology get into it. But I think it takes a lot of experience to get to that point. I think for most people, the psychology and the emotion play into it. But I don't think it has to be that way. It's more like just how it plays out.
Is there a difference between physical and verbal tells? I mean, if you can spot either one of them, a physical tell, a verbal tell, it can either save you or make you some money at the poker table, right?
Oh, sure, yeah. And I would say actually a lot of the times it's more about money being saved, because as most tells play out, the tells of strength and relaxation are a lot more reliable than the tells of weakness, because how it plays out is usually someone's more relaxed when they're betting and they're doing things that they wouldn't be doing if they were bluffing or vulnerable or whatever. So these tells of strength are much more common. And that leads to being able to fold hands that you wouldn't otherwise fold. If you're able to confidently peg somebody as classify them as relaxed in a situation where they're betting, making a big bet on the river, that allows you to fold a lot of hands you wouldn't otherwise fold. So yeah, I think that's when you talk about saving versus making money, a lot of it and saving money is making money in poker. So that's it's a big part of it.
In your opinion, are these areas often neglected by most poker players? In other words, should more players be doing their homework on this subject?
Well, I usually say it's a very minor part of poker. You can be a very strong winning poker player, a big crusher at poker, and never even think about behavior. It's just more of something that it adds a certain percentage of win rate to your win rate if you're already a strong player. That's my basic opinion. But I think a lot of people, beginner level players value tells way too highly, and then there's some because they think it's all about tells or something when they first start out. They're like, oh, it's about bluffing and reading people or whatever, but it's actually like a small part of it. And then you have the other end of the spectrum. I think there's some people that come from an online background that really undervalue tells because they come from that background. They're like, I can beat the game without ever worrying about behavior, which is true. You can, but it's just I think it pays to search for those edges. And if you're a serious player, it's good to devote time into seeking those edges out. And also, not to mention, I think actually for any players, the ability to be more readless is very important. If you're playing against good players, that's actually where knowing about tells is more valuable, because you can say, oh, I've now realized that I'm doing these things that I didn't realized before, and I can block that leak of information, which I didn't know about before. And that's actually what most people tell me about the things I write is like, I've had many people tell me like, oh, I had no clue I was doing that until you pointed it out. And then I realized I was doing it all the time and I stopped doing it, So I actually think that's the main value of learning about tells is like you're subtracting that edge that better players have on you.
You've consulted a couple of November Niners. That must have been very exciting for you.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, the first November Niner I worked for was Amir Lahavit in 2013. Yeah, 2013 for that final table, and then I worked for Max Steinberg this past year. Yeah, it was very flattering. I mean, I loved doing that. It was very interesting and educational because most of my work has been about studying quite weak players and studying trying to categorize the tells of pretty weak players, but these were opportunities to study. Most of those players are very strong, so it's a totally different mindset. And plus, they've had months to prepare strategically and emotionally, and everybody's trying to be as readless as possible and as stoic as possible. So it was just a great opportunity to study people at the top, poker players at the top of their game, basically,
Max Steinberg, very smart guy, one of my favorites. Met him, really enjoyed talking to him. Wonder what those discussions and those meetings were like. They must have been pretty interesting for you as well.
Yeah, for sure. And, it's all been educational. Those have been educational from, strategically for me too, just to see how they prepare and how they think about the game and what they're doing to prepare to. Yeah, just very interesting. Yeah, and Max is a great player and thinks about the game in different ways than other players. So it's just interesting getting different people's perspective on the game.
I was on the website today, readingpokertells.com. So again, you've got the video series for Poker Tells, and you also got a 5-part course on verbal tells, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've got a few free email courses between either on my site. My main site is readingpokertells.com, and then I've got a video aimed course on my readingpokertells.video site, which is where I have my video courses. I kind of split it up. It's kind of weird. I have two different sites, but anyway, yeah, I've got a few courses. If anyone wants to check those out, you can find them on both sites, and there's 2 different kinds, and actually there's like 4 different courses. Yeah, people can sign up and get multi-day courses that have like excerpts from my books and stuff.
I always enjoy this guy. He's a 3-time guest now. He's the author of Reading Poker Tells and Verbal Poker Tells. Zachary Elwood. Zach, thanks a lot, man. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Derek. I appreciate it.